Hi everyone, Michael Howie here. Before we get into this week's episode, I just wanted to thank everyone for signing up to receive the Defender Radio updates via email and announce that Jennifer S. from Seychelles, British Columbia won the Lush Cosmetics giveaway. You can sign up to get updates and also find out about awesome contests by visiting thefurbears.com/updates and opting in to receive the Fur Bears weekly e-newsletter as well as Defender Radio updates. You can also connect with me on Facebook or Twitter at Defender Radio or on Instagram at Howie Michael to find out what I'm up to and learn about other contests and upcoming interviews. It's also a fast and easy way to support the show. This week's episode is supported by the Hardy Hooligan.
This is Defender Radio. Defender Radio is brought to you by the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals.
It's the week of October 2nd, 2017, and this is Michael Howie welcoming you to episode 448 of Defender Radio. I'm feeling tired. Between my own battle with a media organization on how they present conflicts, an ongoing social media argument about coyotes in a specific neighborhood, and the seemingly endless stream of terror attacks, natural disasters, and headlines involving Donald Trump, I really feel tired. And I know exactly why. I'm starting to get burned out. I have generalized anxiety disorder, a mental health condition I was diagnosed with nearly 20 years ago, and I've received multiple types of treatment for it. I'm doing relatively well with it, between medication, healthy choices, and a recent group therapy program. I'm relatively open about this part of my life, because I believe it matters for others who are struggling or living with mental health challenges to hear that they aren't alone, and that treatment is not only possible, but can really help. And with all that has happened in recent weeks, and how I'm feeling myself, I thought it was time to use the show to address burnout, or compassion fatigue, with someone in the mental health field who I trust implicitly. My wife, Kate. Kate is a concurrent disorders outreach specialist for a health network in Southern Ontario, has an extensive background in counselling on issues like addiction, and an education in sociology and social work. She sat down with Defender Radio to talk about recognizing burnout in ourselves and others, learning the first steps we can take to prevent burnout, and how we can ask for help. Please note that this episode and show cannot and should not replace the advice of a medical professional. If you are feeling overwhelmed or in need of help, please contact your family doctor. If you feel that you may hurt yourself, others, or are having any suicidal thoughts, please contact suicideprevention.ca in Canada or suicidepreventionlifeline.org in the United States to find a crisis line or visit a nearby hospital. Before we hear our interview today, I have a quick message about this week's episode supporter. When I'm looking for a meal that satisfies my hunger and my ethics, I head to the Hardy Hooligan here in Hamilton. They have incredible vegan versions of egg salad, chicken salad, and tuna salad daily, as well as savory pies, including my favorite shepherd's pie pasty. They have amazing desserts and even locally roasted coffee in biodegradable cups. The Hardy Hooligan is definitely food worth rioting for. Check them out at 368 Main West in Hamilton, right by Locke Street, or find them on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or online at thehardyhooligan.com. What is burnout? How do we define it for people when we talk about this subject?
So I think that we can talk a lot about, the elements that define it and how to look for it and what does it look like, what does it feel like. But in terms of an actual definition, I did have to kind of look this one up. So looking at just how to sort of sum it up, right, in a way that is sort of easy and palatable. So one that I found that I thought was pretty good was burnout is a state of chronic stress that leads to physical and emotional exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, and feelings of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. So I think that kind of sums it up, like just sort of being in a state of feeling like what you want to do, you're not able to do, or you're not making any progress, you're not getting to the goals that you wanted to get to.
And how is that different from, and I wrote down depression and anxiety. I don't think there's a lot of similarities with anxiety there, but it feels like there's crossover into the realm of depression, which is, there are various types of depression, but is it different in any significant way?
Yes. I mean, I would say that it absolutely is different. I mean, depression is, a mental illness caused by an imbalance of chemicals in the brain, whereas, burnout and sort of caregiver stress or compassion fatigue or all of the titles that burnout kind of comes under is more of a situational feeling and more of a situational way of being, I guess, is a good way to put it. So I guess, the different forms of depression can sort of be treated chemically and pharmacologically as is appropriate, as well as, behavioral interventions. However, I would say, caregiver stress, burnout, compassion fatigue is something that is much more situational and is much more reliant on those behavioral tactics.
But that's not to say that they're mutually exclusive.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think, it's something that you sort of have that trigger stacking, right? Like you can have a diagnosis of depression that is well managed, but if you tack burnout or caregiver stress or compassion fatigue on top of that, then you're no longer managing well. So, it's something that they can absolutely play into each other, I'd say, more than, necessarily not being mutually exclusive. They can really play off of each other and sort of exacerbate, feelings of despair and feelings of sadness and all of that.
I feel that's probably accurate too when I talk about my anxiety, and that's the situation I'm in right now. And as I explained it in the introduction, is just with a lot of stuff going on for me professionally, with all the stuff going on in the world, and the anxiety always maybe being there a bit in the background. It kind of they maybe stack on top of each other, and one of them all of a sudden becomes worse than it might have been. But that moves nicely into what we can do in first steps. So not necessarily, big picture, how we prevent it, but when we're starting to feel that way, and this is a conversation you have with me, and it's not a conversation we have together because I'm told what to do very lovingly.
Guided.
Yes. She's staring at me right now, and it's scary. What are the first steps people should take when they're starting to feel maybe burned out, as you described, or even if they're just thinking about the fact that, burnout is a real thing?
I think one of the most important first steps is to just talk about it, right? Talk about it with somebody who's, aware of your situation and aware of, whatever the work is that you're doing, whether it's advocacy work or whether it is caregiving or any other role, somebody who has that context and can really understand. Because I think one of the big things that we don't do enough of is, being able to sort of verbalize how we're feeling to somebody. Makes us sort of think about it in different ways, which can help us sort of put it into a context that we can deal with better. But we don't do that because we're ashamed or we're embarrassed or we're worried, right? Like that'll make it sound like I'm not doing a good job. Like we all work really hard to present this image of, we've got everything together and we're on top of the ball and nothing gets by us and we're cool as cucumbers. And I think realistically for a lot of us, that's not the case. And I don't think that that pretending really does us any favors. I think it's something that we need to be able to talk to each other about. We need to be able to be honest about. And a lot of the time, you don't say anything because then you sort of have to look for a solution, right? Like if I acknowledge it, then now I have to deal with it. But I guess that's the point of it being a first step, right? So being able to talk about it, being able to just kind of roll it around in your mind, to be able to make it into words that are spoken to someone is a big part of a process of dealing with it, really. So it kind of hits a couple different checkpoints. So I think that's the first thing we should do is just talk about it.
And I think that's true of most mental health and otherwise health issues, is to talk about them and get them out there.
Yeah.
One of the things you've talked a lot about with me and through other presentations I've heard you do over the years is two parts. One is the walking away, which is the one that is, for me, I think the hardest part. And some listeners and followers in social media know I'll have brilliant ideas at 12:30 in the morning on how to actually solve all of the wildlife conflict in the world if people just read my internet comments. And then the other component of that is finding outlets. Those are sort of the two, I think, parts that come up the most, and maybe the ones that should be focused on here. So let's start with the first one. And that's, everyone on the internet is wrong, but I'm right and I'll prove it. How do we walk away? Because for me, I think it's sort of a very specific thing. For a lot of people who are maybe in wildlife rehab, in veterinary care, in caregiving, it's not always necessarily as physical. Like, I can walk away from the computer and be removed from it. But for a lot of people, that's not possible.
And I think that is something that, it relies on insight, right? And knowing yourself and knowing what your limits are and knowing when you're getting close to them. So, I mean, you have to kind of backtrack and say, okay, well, when do I walk away is often the question that I think comes up from that. It's like, okay, well, we know that walking away is good if we're overwhelmed, but when is that? I mean, how do we define that? So I often, I'll sort of encourage people to kind of check in with themselves, and we talk about, checking in your different areas. So how am I doing physically? How am I doing emotionally? How am I doing mentally and spiritually and all of those things? So, and I mean, if you can really sort of separate that out, and that's a skill that you kind of have to practice a little bit, right? But I think that it's something that, once we practice and once we have that skill, then we'll know when we're sort of getting close to our threshold of how much I can deal with and how much I can manage. Obviously to take your example, a good one is, if I'm staying up later than I thought I would, that's like checkpoint number one, right? So looking at, your physical health, literally in your sleep patterns, that's one way to look at it. But I think, and then it's the how afterwards, right? The how to walk away. So know how much you can sort of saying can handle is sort of not the best way to put it, but how much you feel comfortable managing, I guess, in a certain moment. And then giving yourself sort of time increments, saying, you know what, like, I'm going to just step back for 5 minutes, right? Instead of reacting to something, I'm going to respond. So I'm going to give myself time to think about it and to come back. And then in that time that you've given yourself, you may decide that it's really not worth my mental energy to come back at all. Especially with regards to comments on the internet, right? Like, I mean, it's not something that we have a lot of efficacy in terms of changing people's opinion when we're arguing with them over the internet, right? Because we talked about, we talk a lot about different methods of advocacy. And I think, I don't know if you've shared this, globally, but looking at the studies that show that, the more you push somebody, the more they are likely to stand their ground. And
the blowback effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So you're giving yourself just a timeout, not necessarily a walk away, but a timeout gives you a chance to be like, oh yeah, like I remember that's a thing, right? That if I push somebody, it just makes them stand firmer. And, am I going to change this person's mind? Am I going to, be able to elicit any change? Or, is this just taking an emotional toll on me that maybe I can't afford? And so giving yourself that moment, though, that separation, gives you a minute to do that, a minute to kind of have that conversation with yourself and say, how much am I willing to pay for this? Right?
That's I think a very good way of looking at it. And the other part of this I wanted to talk about was finding the outlets. We talked about this before we started the interview. One of the reasons it's kind of amusing is right now we're surrounded by dogs. Ordinarily, I do these interviews when Kate is not home and the dogs ignore me. But since she's home, they're all paying a lot of attention and they're digging and licking and scratching things. And for us, obviously, one of our outlets for both of us is time with our dogs. But let's talk a little bit about sort of the importance of outlets, and then we can talk about why we have pigeons smiling on this week's episode art.
Well, I think, having things that bring you joy is really a need. It's a mental health need. And we do something at work called the 16 Guidelines, which is actually a really cool program if anybody wants to kind of look into it. And our guideline for this week is delight.
Delight.
Delight, And so finding delight in life and finding delight in every day. The reading sort of, we do like a little, sounds kind of religious, but
It does.
But it's not. It's more like the tenets of mindfulness, basically. So
Okay.
we're looking at, so we read the reading or the passage, which is, I don't know, I can't think of a non-religious way to say that, but the writing, maybe? I don't know. That's not helpful. So it basically talks about how, there are always things that when we think about delight, we can think about, I feel delight when I am with my family, when I'm sinking into a hot bath, when, I'm digging into an ice cream cone, like all that stuff, right? And so what this sort of tenant has sort of tasked us with, that's a tough one, is to look for, delight in everyday things and delight in everyday occurrences and to try and share that and spread it across as much as we can. And so just in terms of having those things in our lives that we have delight over. So, I mean, that's sort of another aspect of mindfulness, is just looking at things, with a very sort of different lens, right? And so I think it's easy to say, have these outlets, go for walks, draw the picture, color the picture, play with dogs, play with cats, hamsters, rabbits, I mean, all of those things are great. But I think it's also trying to find little things that delight you in every day. And, that first sip of coffee, like really sort of, acknowledging that and reveling in it for a second longer than you might. So stuff like that, like the little stuff that we kind of take for granted, right? Like those things can be very therapeutic, but we don't kind of harness that moment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean,
It does.
And I think it is important to pursue hobbies and pursue, I can't draw stick people, so that would be incredibly frustrating for me. But I think, if that is something, I know lots of people that love, painting and drawing and artwork in general. And I think that's their outlet, and that's lovely and wonderful. And they should we need to make that a priority. But I think it doesn't necessarily have to be that defined and that big, because I'll have people say to me, well, I don't have a dog. I can't have a dog. I'm allergic and I hate painting. Right. And so, and all these things like, I don't want to go for walks. My feet hurt, or I'm in a wheelchair or whatever. And I think that it's one of those things where we have to look at what is my individual situation and where can I find the moments where I can give myself an outlet. So it might not be all of these things that we fall back on. We always say, have a bath, make a tea, go for a walk.
Yep.
Play with a dog. I mean, those things are easy to say, but not necessarily applicable to everyone. So, it takes really, again, a lot of that insight into how much can I work into my daily schedule and how much can I work into my routine, things that I find delightful.
When you say delight, the first thing in my head is Pizza Delight and that old jingle. I feel like pizza tonight. Do you remember that one?
No, but I feel like pizza is delightful.
We should have pizza for dinner. The cauliflower looked good, but
we're having cauliflower.
But we're talking about pizza, so I feel that we should really own the delight.
All right, well, I can call it pizza if you want, but we're eating cauliflower.
Domestic bliss. Now, one of the things I think is really important, though, for me personally, I use that picture of Pigeon. Pigeon's one of our dogs. He's the one with the one blue eye and the one brown eye, and he was a twice returned, or he was surrendered then returned.
Yep.
To the Humane Society.
He was surrendered, adopted, returned, and then we adopted.
Yeah. And he is a dog who just loves to play. It's fetch. He does the wee pulls. He does the jumps, the whole bit. And that picture of him it was a super muddy day in winter last year, I think. And when he's exercising like that, he shows the light. He just looks happy. And as you're speaking about the light, you're holding Pigeon and he looks like a toddler worming around because he wants to go play with all of the things.
Yes.
And that's why we've had to start and stop again and start and stop again because he dropped 4 toys in a row. But it brings me to because he's worming around now. He's licking your face.
He says that's an exaggeration.
Yes. But for me, just watching him brings joy. It's just that little minute of just pure fun and happy. and just sort of accepting that for what it is and enjoying it and then moving on and remembering it when I need to.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, most people that are going to be listening to this are animal lovers, and I think they really bring out such a great element of our personality and our history, really. I mean, we are animals. We are, come from the same stuff that they do, and, at the end of the day, we all go back to dust, and I think it kind of, it really puts things into context in that, just having that very simple animal awareness and living in the moment. I mean, nobody lives in the moment as much as dogs do. And so it's like I always say, like I learn from them and they're constantly teaching me. And it's sort of, it's refreshing to kind of have, it's frustrating on my end because sometimes, they'll be sore or they'll be tired and they'll still want to go. And I'll think, gosh, guys, like, just take it easy, like you need a minute, you need a day to just relax. But to them, that joy in the moment is what it's all about. And it doesn't matter. Like, I'll deal with being tired later. I'll deal with being sore later. That's a problem for later. And so in a way, like, that's really motivational. And it's really, really humbling that, they are always able to put aside whatever's happening to be able to have that moment of delight and that moment of joy. And I think that, we can learn from that and we can take that and sort of apply it to our own lives. And that would help with burnout significantly if we're able to just find those moments of where you take a breath, you take a breather, and you just kind of reset and go back.
Or never stop going the way Pigeon does. One of the things that I think is very difficult to talk about, and I've come across this in my personal experience dealing with doctors and with healthcare professionals, is explaining how I'm feeling and being heard as a patient. And this is a note that I made I really want to cover off is when you go to a doctor, when you go to a counselor, when you go to a therapist, whomever you're going to seek advice on something like this, what should we keep in mind to best communicate how we're feeling so that we also then get the best treatment back?
I think what I would say to that is really have a good idea of what you're going to say going in. I think we rely on doctors and professionals to ask the right questions and to prod us where we need prodding and all of those things. And I think that often can lead to disappointment because doctors and counselors are not mind readers, as much as we like to pretend. I'm not a doctor. That sounded presumptuous. But anyways, but yeah, so I mean, we as sort of, healthcare providers, we'll use that. We can only really help people with the concerns that are brought to us. And so just taking a few moments, and if you have to, write it down. I mean, write down, I'm feeling this way. This is what triggers me to feel this way. These are potential solutions that I've thought of. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, have an idea. I think we all need to be our own advocates in terms of healthcare. People all the time will complain that, somebody won't listen or those sorts of things, because we also have to keep in mind that we are working under a time limit, and family doctors can sometimes see, 20 to 30 people a day. So, we have to really make good use of that time. And so having that sort of conversation in your mind ahead of time, writing down your bullet points, gives you that sort of efficacy. It gives you that sense of, making good use of that time and really getting your important points across so that you're not leaving the office or the building and saying, oh, geez, I didn't mention this and I meant to tell him about that. And, that day on the bus when I had that really hard time and, that didn't even come up. I mean, we all have those things of like, I wish I'd said. So just having a bit of preparation prior to going into that appointment and keeping in mind that, I think people have what we call white coat syndrome and doctors make them nervous and all that kind of stuff. But remembering that these are people that are providing a service, right? And so they're offering the service and it's up to us to make good use of it and to use time appropriately. And so I think that having that just, a little bit of preparation makes a huge difference.
To wrap up, I wanted to talk about talking about burnout. And you mentioned this when we first started, that we need to talk about, and that's a really important first step. And I feel that's a very important first step when we talk about how we're feeling and how we're going to find help. But, and this is, as you know, and as the audience probably knows by now, one of my big pet peeves when talking about mental health is the number of times people say we need to talk about mental health and then don't actually talk about mental health. They talk about the need to talk about mental health.
We talk about talking.
Exactly. So when we're talking about burnout, and again, not everyone's going to be comfortable coming out and saying, this is how I feel right now. How do we bridge that gap from sort of people knowing the term, knowing it's out there, and maybe at the end of a day, long day, thinking, oh, I'm burned out, and the next day they wake up feeling okay and forget about it. How do we go from there to having just earnest conversations, whether it's within our social group, our family, or within, in the case of the Fur Bears, a relatively large organization among staff and volunteers? What are the steps we can take as individuals to make that more accessible?
Well, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because you want to normalize it because it's something that a lot of us will feel sometime through our careers. But at the same time, you don't want to overuse the word burnout and so that it loses its meaning. Because, we all will say, oh my gosh, I'm so burnt out. And you don't even think about it, right? You're just saying words. And so for somebody who is really feeling like they're in a crisis with their state of burnout, that sort of waters it down. And that's unfortunate. And I think, so we kind of have to keep in mind both things. But I think we need to sort of have maybe regular check-ins. Maybe that's something that with regards to an organization, we talk about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how burnt out do you feel today? And talk about why and talk about what goes into it, right? And sort of, I think it's not are you burnt out or not? I think it's sort of there are steps leading up to it that feel the same. So I think, talking about those steps leading up to it, as I said, first step, right? And so normalizing the conversation while still giving reverence to the thing you're talking about, I think is the most important part. So, but at the end of the day, it just comes down to people's need to be able to speak their needs and speak their truths and be able to say, what, I'm struggling. And I know that we all know that that's hard, right? We all struggle with that. But to be able to say that, I need help with this and I can't do this by myself. And we all know that, right? Sometimes I find that this sort of sounds a little bit harsh, but what I've found with regards to counseling is giving you some motivation for that. So if you're not confident enough to do that for yourself, think about the work that you're doing, right? And wanting to be the most effective advocate that you can be. And so in order to do that, you need to manage burnout. And so if not for yourself, ask for help for the animals that you're helping, right? If you don't feel strong enough in being able to say, I need this and I feel this way, find that strength with the work that you're doing, right? It can kind of work both ways, right? It can sort of lead you to burnout and help you get out of it. And I think that that's really the ultimate, that we're trying to do is try to find ways to be able to do this work and not have it cripple us.
Please contact your family doctor if you're feeling overwhelmed or in need of help. And if you're having suicide thoughts or worried that you may hurt yourself or others, contact suicideprevention.ca in Canada or suicidepreventionlifeline.org in the United States to find a crisis line or visit a nearby hospital. That's the show for this week, folks. I want to thank Kate for taking the time to talk about this important issue with me again, and to let you know that we have a compassion fatigue webinar that will be coming up later this month, in which you can ask questions and join in discussion about solutions. More will be coming up about that soon. Until next time, this is Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.